In this lesson, we'll finish the compositing process for our render. Let's begin. We set a good foundation for our compositing in the last lesson. We still have a few more effects to add before we move on, so let's get started. First, make sure you're in the compositing workspace, found here at the top. Now we can hit F12 on our keyboard, or go over here and go to Render, Render Image. You want to have your rendered image displayed over here on the right side if it's not already. Alright, so we have a few easier effects to add to our image, and then one complicated one. Let's start with the easier effect as a warm-up, and then move to the more complicated effect. Let's start by adding a new image overlay. Our first step is to select these three nodes here on the right side. We're going to zoom out a bit, and then we're just going to move them over here to the right to make some room. Now we can add our new nodes. So we'll hit Shift and A, go to Search, we'll type in Image, choose Image, and then one more, Shift and A, Search, we'll type in Mix, M-I-X, and choose Mix Color, and place that here, over on the left. Now we can get our new nodes connected. So we can zoom into these new ones we just added. We're going to drag this Mix node that we added on top of this yellow line here. And then lastly, we can plug in this image socket to the bottom image socket here on this Mix node. As with all of these image overlays, we're going to have to load our image so that it's not black over here. So we can just zoom in here and then select this little white folder icon. Now navigate to the folder that we've had all these other textures in, and we're going to choose Grunge, one here at the very top. With it selected, we can just click Open Image. With our image loaded, we can now see what this grunge is going to do for us. It's going to add this splotchy darkness and lightness across the entire image and give it kind of an aged and stained look. If you ever worked with charcoal on paper, this is also a similar effect you might see on the edges of your frame. This would just be caused by your fingerprints and things like that, so we're trying to replicate that kind of hand-drawn feeling. Now let's move over here to our Mix node that we added, and we're going to switch from Mix mode to Overlay instead, which is down here at the bottom. And then we're going to change the factor from 1 down to 0.75 and then hit enter. You'll notice that we didn't use the multiply mode this time. And that's because we not only want to overlay the dark parts of the image, but also the light parts. The overlay mode allows us to do that. That means we're getting the dark areas from the grunge map on the tops and bottoms, but we're also getting some slight lightening here in the middle from the overlay as well. We also lowered the factor to just 0.75 as we want to diminish the effect slightly. And that's it for that effect. So now we can move on to the next one. Now we'll be adjusting the contrast of the image using a node called RGB Curves. So first let's add that new node. We can zoom out here, and then we're just going to leave this gap here as it is. So we'll hit Shift and A, search, then type in RGB and choose RGB Curves. Now we can just drag this up here on this line. We're going to place it off here to the left side and then drop it here so it automatically connects it. Now let's zoom in on this new node. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be using this new RGB Curves node to adjust the contrast of our image to make the brights brighter and the darks darker. We'll accomplish this by changing the shape of this diagonal line here in the middle of the grid. The bottom left of this grid represents the darkest pixels in our image, and the top right represents the brightest pixels in our image. To make each of these areas a little bit more intense, we're going to create what's known as an S-curve. It's called this because when we're done, the line will look somewhat like the letter S. Let's start by adding two new points on this diagonal line. You can do this simply by clicking on this line. So we're just going to click on the line here and here. Don't worry about exactly where these points are, just place them roughly here and here. We're going to be moving them in a second. Let's start with the lower point that we just added. As an example of what this dot is doing, let's just click and drag this dot to a new location and then let go and let the image on the right side update. We can see here by moving this dot, we've significantly changed the brightness of our image, specifically the darker tones. And that's because this dot here is on the lower half of this grid. These lower areas in the bottom left of this grid are what control the dark spots on our image. If we grab this dot and move it higher, we'll see that this should get brighter. And then if we grab it and move it much lower, we should see that it gets darker. So you have a lot of control over the image just by moving this dot around and changing which parts of the dark areas are getting brightened or darkened. So with this bottom left dot still selected, we can tell it's selected because it's highlighted here. We're going to be changing these two numbers. So this first number here controls the X position. We're going to type in 0.175 and then hit enter. And then don't worry if it only says 0.1 here, it's just shortening the value. It does still know the exact value we typed in. And then for the Y location, the second number here on the right, we're going to click this and then type in 0.15 and then again hit enter. This small adjustment to this dot has just made the darker areas of our image a little bit darker. Now let's do a similar process over here for this top right dot, changing the brightness of our image. So So again, if we move this around, we can see our image over here will update with the brighter values. Because there's not a whole lot of bright values in our image, we won't notice as much of a change here. Our image is predominantly dark, so this one is a little bit less sensitive than the bottom left slider. So now let's get this in place. So first, make sure you have it selected so that it's highlighted here in white. And then the first number for the X, we're going to change that to 0.7. And then the second value, we're going to hit here and then type in 0.8. As I mentioned, this change is a little bit more subtle because of the lack of bright areas in our image, but it still did brighten some areas. With the contrast for the image dialed in, we have one more image overlay to add before we move on to the more complicated effect I mentioned earlier. We are going to need to make a little bit more room though, so let's zoom out here on the left. We're going to drag over here, and then this time we're just going to grab this dilate node, so this purple one here, and we're going to move it left to make room here between these two. So just move this over to the left, and then make sure you have a gap between this purple node and then these two red ones on the right. And then this time, rather than creating anything new, we're actually just going to be copying some old work. So we're going to zoom out, and now we're looking for the paper fibers image. So we'll need this node here, the paper fibers. We can just select on that, and then we're going to hold Shift and select this multiply node here. So now we have both of these selected. We can zoom out, hit Shift and D for duplicate. That'll make copies of each of these nodes. Then we can just click to place them over here, and then we'll move them together. So we just pull these together, that way they're a bit closer. With our nodes copied, let's get them connected. So we're going to place the paper fibers over here to the left, drag this multiply node here on top of this line, and then plug the image socket on paper fibers into the bottom of the multiply node. Now you can space them out so that nothing's overlapping. The only thing that we need to adjust is the mix color node, as the paper fiber image is already loaded for us. So let's zoom in here, and we're going to switch it from the multiply mode to screen instead, found here. And then one last change, we're going to switch the factor down to 0.015, and then enter. You'll notice this time we use the screen mode, which is essentially the opposite of the multiply mode that we've used a few times. The screen mode only overlays the white parts of the image on top of the underlying render. We've also dramatically lowered the factor value to make sure that it's really subtle. If we zoom in down here into this dark spot of our image, we can now see that we have this paper fibers texture overlaid across the entire image. We really only want a tiny bit of this brightening across the image though, as we don't want to lose our shadows entirely. And if, just by example, if I increase this factor to something larger, we'll notice that the shadows almost entirely disappear. And we don't want that for the image, so we're going to keep this pretty low, set to 0.015. And now if we zoom in, we just get a little bit of kind of softening of the contrast just for these shadow areas. This final image overlay is actually a pretty important step. As you'll remember, our goal is to replicate the look of an image on an actual piece of paper. It's pretty difficult to get such a deep and pure black when printing on paper, so limiting it to a really dark gray is actually a little bit more realistic for this effect. So by overlaying this light image on top of the black shadows, we're bringing them up slightly and making them more of a dark gray, which is more realistic for printed paper. It's also introducing just a little bit more visual texture to the image. We can see all these little paper fibers here on the image now, which is just a nice effect. Alright, the time has come to add this complicated effect that I keep hyping up. However, there's a little secret. You've already done this effect once before while creating the object material. We want to utilize the normal channel to isolate the top surfaces of objects in our scene. Then we'll be removing many of these image overlays that we added from just those areas. This will help restore brightness to those areas and really help the contrast and readability of the image. Many of the overlays that we added darken the image, which also darken the highlights. This step will help us restore their brightness without affecting the midtones or the dark areas that look pretty cool right now. Unfortunately, Blender doesn't let us copy the nodes that we used in our material over to the compositing workspace, as they are technically different, but it shouldn't take too long to set them up again. Our first step is to make room for them here on the left side. So let's zoom out. We're going to be going all the way over here to the left. We're going to select our actual render here and pull it over here just to make a bunch of room here for the new nodes. Now let's add the nodes that we'll need. We're going to be placing them up here above this line from left to right. So we'll hit Shift and A, search, type in SEP. We're going to choose separate color, place that here to the left, Shift and A, search, HUE. We're going to choose hue saturation value, Shift and A, search, type in INV for invert color, Shift and A, search, color ramp, place that here, and then one more, Shift and A, search MIX, mix color, place that here. Now we can connect all these nodes together. So let's go from left to right. So first we'll zoom in over here on the left, and feel free to space these nodes out as you move just to make everything a little bit less cramped. So we'll drag from here the normal socket on the rendered image and place it into the image for the separate color. Then we can go from blue to the image socket on the hue saturation value. Now we'll go from image here down to the invert color. Now we can zoom out a bit, and then we're going to plug the invert color into the factor on the bottom of the color ramp. And then this right here is where it gets a tiny bit tricky. So first let's zoom out a little bit. And now we're going to grab this mix color node here that starts out with the paper lines. So if you follow your paper lines image here, it should be on the bottom. You're going to want to go all the way over here to the mix color that connects it to the main line. We're going to pull this up slightly. So we need to get to a specific socket here that's sort of hidden behind it. Now from our color ramp up here on the top, we're going to connect from this image socket all the way down here onto the factor socket here for the one that we just moved for this mix node. Then we're going to drag again from the same image socket on the color ramp to the top socket here on this mix node that we just added. And then we're going to plug from the image socket here onto the factor socket for this mix color node just before the one that we moved. All right, so we have everything connected. Let's just quickly discuss what we did. We started this whole chain here by going from the normal socket to this separate color. This normal socket is what produces that red, blue, green, and black image that we saw way back when we made the material for the object. This is how we're isolating just the top surfaces of these objects. We'll remember that they're blue, which is where the separate color comes in. So we're choosing to only choose the blue color and then put that into the hue saturation value. The other odd thing that we noticed was how we connected this color ramp to a few different locations. This color ramp here was branched off into two different nodes, one of which has this extra mixed color node that we added. We need this color ramp to power two different settings, but they each require a slightly different approach, so we added this extra mixed color node here to help with that. Lastly, we plugged this color ramp node into the factor slider for two different mix nodes, each of which are responsible for the paper fibers as well as the paper lines texture. This means that this color ramp is now being used as a mask for these overlay images, rather than the simple opacity slider that we had before, which is just the factor set to 1. This is how we're going to eliminate the overlay textures from only certain parts of the image, while leaving the other parts untouched. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about how these nodes are connected and the logic behind their orientation, let's adjust the settings on each node to finish the effect. We'll go left to right. We'll start over here, and here we have separate color. As usual, we don't really have anything to change here, other than noting that we're using the blue channel. Next, we have the hue saturation and value. This time we're going to drag the saturation down to 0. Just like last time, we're turning the blue color that we're outputting here down to a medium gray by getting rid of all the color from the image. Next, we have the invert color. Again, no changes here. It's just useful to note that this is flipping the color of the image. So now our image is mostly white with areas that are marked out in a dark gray. Now we can adjust the color ramp found here. The only change we need to make is to select this black slider here on the left side, and then for the position, we're going to set that to 0.7 and then hit enter. All we're doing here is significantly increasing the amount of black in the image to help narrow down the areas that we want to remove from the overlay textures. For this effect, the more black in the mask we're creating, the more areas that the overlay texture will be removed from. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of masking, it's essentially using a black and white image to control the visibility of an effect or an image. In our case, the black parts of the image tell Blender to remove the effect from this area, while the white parts of the image tell Blender to keep the effect in these areas. Shades of gray are also viewed at their respective brightness values. For example, a 50% gray mask would limit the effect to 50% of its typical strength. Now let's zoom out and move on to this lower mix node that we added. This is the one that exists between the color ramp and this multiply node here, this mix color, that controls the paper fibers. So we're going to zoom in here to adjust this. This mix node is here to adjust how the mask is affecting the removal of the paper fibers overlay image. Up to this point, the paper fibers have been a pretty strong presence in our image. We're going to take this opportunity to lessen their impact now that we have so many other overlapping effects, while also removing them entirely from the top surfaces. So first, we're going to go over here to Mix and switch it to the Multiply effect. And then we're going to change this color found here on the bottom. So we can just click on this color bar, and now we're going to change the value to 0.5, making it a 50% gray. And we'll notice as we change this value here that the amount of overlay across the entire image changes as well. Higher numbers mean more paper fibers across the rest of the image, and lower numbers mean less paper fibers across the entire image. We're going to leave ours set to the middle at 0.5. We will notice, however, that as we zoom in here onto the top surface of, say, this bridge, it doesn't matter what color we make this, it doesn't add any more paper fibers to the top surfaces because we're removing them entirely from those areas. So anywhere that's the top of a model is being removed entirely. This slider here only affects the areas around those. So again, we'll just leave this set to 0.5. And that's it. That was our final compositing effect for our final image. We can zoom out here on the left to see all the different nodes that we used to create this effect. By selectively removing the overlay images from the top faces of objects, we've injected a lot more contrast and brightness back into our image, without removing all of the character that the overlays added. At this point, we've reached the final look for our image by using various techniques and overlay images to make our render really look like it's printed on some rough paper. As a quick example, this is what our render looked like before we started this process. So I can just drag from here this image socket and plug it over here into the reroute, and we'll see just how much our image has changed over just these last 2 lessons. This render doesn't look bad by any means, but I think it definitely looks better when we connect all the effects together and get all the different overlays on top of each other. You can really see just how much age and character we were able to add to our image with just a little extra effort in the compositing workspace. We're getting pretty close to the end of our class, but we're not quite done yet. In the next lesson, we'll animate the movement of our camera. I'll see you there.